for the simple, obviously, this is a very old idea. As we know, that human society has a great places a great value on the capacity to share ideas through language. And as you can see in the notes below, that is very important because language and speech has provided human species with a unique advantage of being able to transmit information free of genetics. Otherwise, it was a set of behavioral genetics or somehow encoded genetically behavior, which makes, for example, birds know how to make nests and ants how to build nests. But there is no way in which there can be a process of teaching by itself, none that we know of at least. But human beings can transmit ideas and notions over time and space by the use of language and thought. And that has provided us with a unique, or perhaps a unique selection advantage. And this may have been the critical part driving our evolution about 100,000 years ago, when we diverged from Neanderthals and became contemporary human beings. And contemporary human cultural society is only around last 25 or 30,000 years. And almost all of it is guided by linguistic diversity and all the languages have evolved fairly rapidly within the last 25 to 30,000 years. So these kinds of proliferation of language and thought has occurred at great speed, much faster than genetic changes could have occurred in the last few thousand years. Of course, the fact is also there that symbolic representation of ideas, whether by word or by act, gave rise to the alphabet as we speak and alphabet as we write. And you could make use of these symbols to represent almost anything at all. So you have different kinds of symbolic representation like Chinese language or cuneiform language, which have very different grammars, and the usual Indo-Sanskritic languages that we know of. And but whatever it is, the rules of this are hardwired. And Confucius, way back, whatever, 500 BC or whatever, gave this idea about why thought is important. As you can read out, it's a very interesting way of looking at the world. When names are incorrect, speech is not reasonable. When speech is not reasonable, things are not done. When things are not done, structure of society is harmed. And then, of course, harm punishments do not fit the crime. And when punishments do not fit the crime, the people don't know what to do. So this can be modified in psychiatry. Can we have the next slide? So you'll be introduced to these ideas of Nancy Andreasen, Frank Fish, Noam Chomsky, and to some extent even people like Michael Foucault. So when the names of things are incorrect, when people use neologism or paraphasias, speech does not sound reasonable. Disorder of discourse, like what happens with schizophrenics. When speech does not sound reasonable, things are not done properly. Communication deviance, as we understand with schizophrenia. When things are not done properly, the structure of the psyche is harmed. Psychopathology and social disability arises. And when the structure of this psyche is harmed, which is otherwise called madness, treatments may not always fit the diseases. And when treatments do not fit the disease, psychiatrists will not know what to do. So it's very, very important that we understand the structure and the nature of the thought, because we have to understand what our patients are saying and why they are saying what they are saying. Can we have can we have the next slide? This is more of an amusing aside, but it just tells you how important thought and language are to society itself. So what are the basic definitions that we are going to be working with? Okay. One, of course, is that's very difficult to define thought. Thinking is a process that results in a product called thought, which is a circular kind of logic, but that's all there is. Nobody knows its origins, and whether it is a purely functional attribute, does it have a directionality, does its origins, we have no clear idea. What we know is that our brains work with a kind of logic, and this is coded in time and space. Um, for example, we can deduce a particular from the general. People have been watching fruits fall for years, but it took the genius of Newton that everything that falls on Earth is falling because of the presence of a force called gravity. You can't see gravity, you can't touch gravity, you can't feel gravity, but you can understand what gravity is. So it's purely a deductive logic because of this universal aspect of something. It is free of perception per se. So it's a deduction you have made. Okay, and so every apple or everything that falls is falling because of gravity. Whereas inductive logic is the opposite. You're deducing general principles from the particular. Why did the apple fall down? Why didn't it go up? And what is the force? What is the nature of this? And the same force can be applied to look for the movement of the moon, movement of the earth, the movement of the solar system, and whether it's an apple or the moon or the stars, this inductive logic becomes very clear. This kind of logic gives rise to concepts, common features such as new categories, falling of apples and movement of earth, etc., creates a concept called gravity, which was not really understood before that. And we can also give rise to new categories. Grouping of these concepts, for example, on gravity, gives rise to the category of fundamental forces, which ultimately give rise to will a nucleus and electron also obey laws of gravity, or will we have new laws? So everything becomes understandable in terms of conceptual categories, which are very different from purely perceptual categories. So thought disorders, therefore, are deficits in both deductive and inductive logic, which lead to errors in concept and category formation, which are then evident in speech and behavior. And it's the job of the psychiatrist to try and define what these errors in logic and concept and category formation are. Okay, so this is the basic premises of this. Can we go to the next one? Now, this is again an aside. There's a very famous essay uh, by an English poet called Ramanujam, who's spent his entire life, I think, in Chicago after moving out from Karnataka about 1960. One of the most famous poets in both Kannada and English. He translated a very wonderful book called Speaking of Shiva, which is a translation of Shaivite hymns. But he wrote this very interesting essay, which is quoted at the bottom. Is there an Indian way of thinking? And which currently is a bit, you can only read it on the web. And so he put this question in four different ways. Is there an Indian way of thinking? Is there a Indian way of thinking, etc., etc., pointing out the plurality of thought, of philosophical thought and poetry tradition in India. But I paraphrased it for this. So, is there a schizophrenic way of thinking? Is there a schizophrenic way of thinking? Is there a schizophrenic way of thinking? And is there a schizophrenic way of thinking itself? And we'll try to answer each one of these questions in different ways. Can we carry on? Can I go to the next one? Yeah. So, what is normal thinking? We all know that we have fantasy thinking, imaginative, and rational thinking. Uh, on the right hand side, two major aspects of this. One is association, that sensation and perception give rise to simple ideas like colors, sounds, blue, red, yellow. You can identify things. So sensation and perception give rise to simple ideas. Then you get an association that green plants sometimes have colored flowers, sometimes they have yellow fruits. So you get all different kinds of things. And the shapes and the sensations of all these give rise to complex thoughts, which you can then reflect on what a mango looks like, or an apple looks like, or what the redness of an apple looks like, and whether apple means a fruit or a computer. All these complex thoughts will arise from these reflections. And thinking links together all these ideas by association. So to many young people, an apple will only mean a computer, whereas to their parents, it will always mean a fruit. And loosening of these associations thus becomes a symptom. On the faculty side, there's the opposite, that there are processes in your brain which actually control the generation, the creation of words, the creation of grammar, the creation of the motor output of speech, the construction of adjectives, pronouns, adverbs, and all these are separate aspects. So these are then feed in through your perception, reflective, and other functions. and this creates an interplay between thought and language, and which produces systemic but a modular structure of language. So this language is putting together of various aspects of neuropsychological function. So both these theories have their own uh, advantages and can be explored in different ways. And of course, we then once we have defined all these disorders of form and disorders of categories and language and communication, we are ultimately interested as psychiatrists in this neurological or neural correlates or biological correlates. In addition to all this, in the recent, let's say, half a century, there has also been a very great improvement or advances rather, I don't know if it's an improvement, in so-called um, information technology, or IT as it's called. Now, the whole of IT, information technology, still cannot recapitulate even the simplest rules of neurophysiology. But the rules of how you create language and thought, because they are coded, can also be coded by computers or into computers. And very long ago, in the 40s and 50s, Chagas and Broadbent actually suggested that information theory itself can be used as a model for understanding thought and action. Broadbent, for example, famously quoted that schizophrenia occurs because of a deficit in informational filters, and something that Claude Shannon also had suggested, that information theory itself can explain how overloaded information pathways can break down after a while. Can I have the next slide? Between this, there are two other aspects which you need to understand. One is a stream of consciousness. Now, this is a constant flow of ideas. As many of you would realize if you think about your own thinking, some of you may be listening to what I'm saying. Some of you may not find it particularly interesting. Your thoughts may go off somewhere else. And so your mind can have infinite number of thoughts, infinite patterns of thinking, and it can get distracted by various events. It will get distracted by a news slide. It will get distracted by a phone call, and all this can happen almost continuously. So there are infinite number of associations, but at the same time, there's a determining tendency, which means that some thoughts and actions are more likely to be linked to each other. For example, if you're hungry, your thoughts about food may almost in a determining kind of way try to make you recall what is there in the fridge, is what you want really there, should you go out and get something. So there's an overall kind of borders to which this river of thought is directed, through which this river of thought is directed. So these choices are not random, these are directed in a non-random manner, but how exactly this randomness and non-randomness differs is not very clear. In the notes section, whenever you see them, is a passage from a novel called Ulysses, which is by a person called James Joyce. The end of the book is a 40-page sentence without any punctuation. It's just words. And he is trying to record his own stream of consciousness. So the moment you put your punctuation in, it makes some kind of sense. But if you read it without the punctuation, it looks like word salad. So this is the classical issue. So a normal person who is writing what is supposed to be the most important English book of the 20th century can show evidence of schizophrenia-like speech, which has now become the literary classic, but to you and me would appear like formal thought disorder unless we knew what he was thinking about. So a little bit of punctuation clarifies all this. And you can read that at leisure whenever you have the time. Yeah, can I have the next one? So language, that is thinking. So what is language? Language has to be based on a true philosophy, as Rousseau suggested 200 years ago, and reflect whatever simple issues there are in the mind. Language should thus therefore almost always be precise, but at that time, the French neurologists and the Europeans were just discovering various forms of aphasia, etc., etc. So whether they were describing aphasias or GPI or the kinds of organic brain disorder that give rise to incoherent speech is not very clear. Of course, it's a chicken and egg problem. Are thoughts expressed by words, or words guide the development of thoughts? And you can debate about this endlessly, or towards the end of the lecture. But again, it's important to remember that a person like Socrates never wanted his thoughts to be recorded because he felt very strongly that words imprison thoughts. And once you write things down, you become constrained to thinking like they think, which is why you should never carry an ICD 10. Because the moment you carry ICD 10 and read it over and over again, your thoughts about psychiatry become constrained by ICD 10. The words have always had a symbolic meaning. For example, the Bible or the Quran or the Guru Granth Sahib or whatever, or the Vedas are held in mystical awe from a generation when reading and writing were not universal. So, in societies where only few people could read and write, the very act of writing, became a divine process, like we were talking about, like just like psychiatry was a divine illness. So, writing also was a divine issue. But at the end of it, language is a socially constructed and codified spheres. We learn words. A language is, therefore, at one level, a social construct. And we'll come to that. But for example, the same word in different languages can mean completely somewhat different things. For example, in Eastern India, uh, in Bengal, for example, it's you eat water, jal khabo, which would be completely nonsensical to a non-Eastern language person. So there is a kind of a shared social communicative aspect of it, which we need to understand. But at the root of it, it's also a biological construct because it is related to functions in the brain. Now, can we have the next one? So coming first to formal thought disorders. Now, formal thought disorders have been around for a long time, the way we understand it. Earlier descriptions often mixed it up with organic symptoms, and confusion, etc., were also put in as FTD. But Ghislaine was one of the first to point out that patients of psychiatric illness have a disorder in the mechanisms that forms and combines words before they reach the tongue. The movements of the tongue itself are quite all right. So the disorder is, inverted commas, higher up, which meant that it is a psychological process rather than a purely motoric process. So he's one of the first ones to understand that the disorder that we are talking about is of a different level rather than purely neurological speech disorders. Grissinger, one of the earliest mid-19th century psychiatrists, also described that there is a deep construction of thought process itself. So by about 100, 200 years ago, it was understood that in psychiatric disorders, there are deep processes of thinking itself. And he pointed out that these thoughts, that perceptions are called upon, which are based on not on the internal content but external similarity, and which are based upon a deficient reciprocal action of both halves of the brain. Okay, so this has now been extended uh, in the 21st century to or late 20th century by people like Frith, who pointed out that there was a hyper awareness of the neurological processes that are so-called subconscious. So that the inner language that the brain is generating and then suppressing and only emitting certain thoughts has now you are now aware of the inner workings of the brain, of the mind, and that is being projected out as a form of thought disorder because the levels or to separate the various streams of consciousness have now broken down. Whereas Nasrallah, on the other hand, pointed out that there is a hyper awareness of particular functions or states. Why are these important? Because these are things which can be investigated with EEG or MRI now. So Fritz suggests that down of these internal awareness states gives rise to formal thought disorder at one level, and catatonia is the same thing as long as when the motor effects, when the motor aspects are being focused on. Can I have the next one? Seglas provided all the other some of the other processes that which are even now used, increase or decrease in tempo, in form. Uh, Patients start having different notes and tones, or make animal sounds, or sound very pompous, or have exaggeration. People talk about themselves in the third person, have clumsy turns of phrase. So this is not particularly relevant in current practice. This is just to show that these ideas have a very long occurrence. Jackson of the Jacksonian March also pointed out that there's a loss of propositional value in speech, and of course, there's a positive and a negative thought disorder. Kraepelin, of course, used all these definitions and added paraphasias, acataphasias, and all these other disorders that we know of. Uh, can I have the next one, please? We'll come to the most famous thing of Bloiler. Now, this is Bloiler, as you all know by now, posted the four A's. And his ideas about formal thought disorder are probably the most influential in our current understanding of psychiatry. So his idea was that, going back to 4 slides ago about associations, so his point was that associations lost continuity, and threads lose this in bits or sets or large segments, so entire thought can get disordered. The new associations that come follow false pathways by accident or contiguity, and when extreme, completely is confused. So this idea of having a goal to your talk, for example, a complex hierarchy of ideas with subordinate loops. For example, when we are talking about this lecture, there's an overall theme of formal thought disorder, but that there are some loops of Kraepelin, Bloiler, Chomsky, etc., etc. When you have to plant, when you have to be a farmer, then you have to have sub loops on when you will plow the ground, when you will till the ground, when you will buy the seeds, when you will actually plant the seeds. So there's sub loops to every goal, and all these things have to be done simultaneously. These threads, may singly or in combination, become ineffective in thinking in schizophrenia. And below that is a very elaborate sample from Bloiler's textbook, which describes, at the time of the new moon, Venus stands in August Sea of Egypt and lights up uh, harbors of Suez, Cairo, and Alexandria. Caliph city goes on to describe India. It goes on to describe Parsis and Caucasians, and Indian barley, rice, and sugarcane. So the patient, the sample which Bloiler has noted down, actually demonstrates how the loss of association he would on which he based his loosening of association. This is a very nice example. So I've just added that to the slide. Can I have the next one? So, so all this that example will tell you, if we have the if you see that. Uh, So ideas that have little or no connection to the main idea should have been excluded, come into play. The speech becomes more and more incoherent, and sometimes when all the threads break, it becomes a thought block, and new ideas that have no connection to the previous one emerge. And this is a very distressing symptom, because it's like a waterfall, and suddenly it gets stopped, and then a new one begins. So it's very disruptive. Of course, the other side can be, it can also be, make standard phrases to fill up these gaps, or condensation or fusion of ideas can occur, which these two examples point out. This is a patient of ours who he spoke fluent English. So when he was asked to come to LIMHANS, he condensed the rules of two different languages. Nim means you in Kannada, Hans means bird in Sanskrit Hindi, and therefore Nimhans uh, implied that his family thought he was bird-brained. So you can see what confusion there arises, or how condensation of the concept can occur across three different languages between Kannada, Hindi, and English, but the concepts are the same. So the conceptual clarity, the conceptual rules can use words from three different languages and make a unique concept for the person that people think that he is bird brained. And on the other hand, this whole issue of using very odd or stilted speech. A student at the university started using French words. He would refer to an apple as pome. And obviously, if he goes to a shop and asks for a kilo of pome in Bangalore, nobody could make sense of this. And we'll come to that, what it means. Can I have the next one? So there are these indirect associations which can occur, or there can be inclination to stereotypies. And the concepts themselves may get distorted. As I showed you in the previous slide, uh, condensation will congeal several concepts into one due to a feeling tone complex. And the symbolism can also become fused. And of course, they can be sometimes nonsensical. The example that I put in the notes below is a patient. I think Dr. Shri may have seen him also. One of the patients says that he does not want to pass urine because he is sure that he is passing diamonds in the urine because the urine sparkles, and this is occurring because he has been told he's got a golden voice and sang like Muhammad Rafi. If he has a golden voice, that means his throat is made of gold. It's very silly to have just a throat made of gold, and therefore his whole body is made of gold. And a body made of gold can obviously pass urine, which is made of diamonds. So you can see how these ideas slip from one to the other in that feeling tone. He was feeling grandiose, and then several ideas guided this whole uh, generalization and gave rise to with this very bizarre kind of explanatory model in terms of his indirect associations. Can I have the next one? Now, he also described autistic thinking, and this by now, since you already spent some time in psychiatry, you'll be these are basically the rules of differences between logical and artistic thought. So logical thought corresponds to reality, the reproduction of all the connections that reality offers, whereas autistic thought is typically directed by affective needs. And according to Bloiler, could occur dementia of recalls, dreams, mythology, superstition, daydreams, poetry, etc., and uses illogical material uh, by choice. Okay, and the last line is perhaps the most important, that our conscious finite mind is actually unable to differentiate in autistic and reality thinking. And you play around with reality to create autistic versions of reality, in the sense that we often say that each man's reality is his own. So the way you listen, each one of you listens to a lecture will be unique to you yourself. So we are constantly reinterpreting so-called reality into a private meaningfulness. And that is the process of autistic thinking. So therefore, autistic thinking has a very real function to impart a private meaning to neutral events outside. And that is a very, very important function. So, so therefore, autism may be a thought exercise, and does it have its own phylogenetic use to create the notion of personhood is also something that we need to understand. It can get disordered, but in its basic rules, it may be actually quite useful. So can I have the next one? So, so in schizophrenia, there is a breakdown in association. There is interpretation of thoughts, wherein no understandable connection with the overall chain of thoughts. So this can be transitory, derailment, substitutions, omission. The grammatical and syntactical structures are disturbed. There can be desultory, a loss of continuity. Speech is grammatically correct, but certain ideas force their way, substitution, omission, fusion, and dribbling. So I've given an example in the notes below, and you can read that at your leisure. For example, the patient says, I am writing on paper. The paper I use is from a factory of Perry and Co. The factory is in England. I'm assuming that. The name Perry and Co., the city of London. The city of London is in England. That I know from school. My last teacher of that was August A. He is a man with black eyes. I like black eyes. There are blue and gray eyes too, and yet others. That snakes have green eyes. All people have eyes. Those who don't have eyes are blind. The blind ones are led by the arm. So you can see how the way it just drifts. Like there's a loss of continuity. So it's basically an example of desultory and driveling thinking, so that it becomes gradually more and more away from the stream of which the person was started talking about. Okay, he was asking a question, and this is what he ended up with. So this kind of thinking is classical. According to Bloiler, the example is again from Bloiler's textbook. So although the language is technically accurate, there are no alphabetical mistakes, the sentences are connected properly, punctuation is used properly, but it is all actually meaningless. So although everything is correct, there is no meaning being transmitted. Can I have the next slide? So this is the thought block. Blocking may occur in motility, action, memory, or even in perception, according to Kraepelin. And this differs from the inhibition that's seen in depression, which is an increase in viscosity of a fluid in a tube. Kraepelin was prone to give very elaborate physical explanations for most of these things, while blocking is like shutting a valve. Once the blocking is overcome, the rhythm of thought is normal, and therefore this may be very troublesome. Modern writers, people I think like I forget, I think it was Jameson, who wrote about bipolar disorder, described uh, no, sorry, it was somebody else, described formal thought disorder as something like a linguistic dyspnea. Most of us don't have to think about what we are going to say. Speech, we just start speaking. Whereas if you had to make a conscious effort to track your thought to say the word, it would actually be very, very painful. Like dyspnea. Dyspnea is defined as conscious breathing. So once you have to be conscious of your own consciousness, it is actually a very troublesome experience. Many people describe this as being in a fog, in a ground glass. Their thoughts run away from their mind. They are no longer able to communicate what they want to say, at least in the early phases of schizophrenia. So this experience of formal thought disorder also has a subjective component when people really feel bewildered about their own lives. Okay, so thought block and these kinds of formal thought disorders have a very peculiar subjective component which we don't often always inquire about. Can I have the next one? Now then we come to the more uh, let's say contemporary ideas. As you all know, the speech by now that Chomsky, who a linguistic theorist, suggested a kind of generative grammar theory uh, based upon his idea about linguistics itself, which is still being debated. And you can read much more detailed accounts of it on references, which I'll share later. But we all know that children start making sounds, phonemes, then you start having words, there's morphological aspects, then you learn grammars and subject verb association, that is syntax, then you learn different words, which is semantics, and you use it to learn discourse and pragmatics, which discourse is just the capacity to talk a lot, and pragmatic is to know what to say and when to say. Now, we all know that this corresponds to the growth of the brain. The first sounds to be spoken are labial sounds, ma, pa, etc. The last sounds to be learned are the palatal sounds like h, gh. So as the pyramidal system matures, new sounds can be created. These sounds are then organized into words, and at all these points, so all children are born with the capacity to learn almost any language. By the end of the first year, by this process of synaptic pruning and language acquisition, only certain so-called first language rules are encoded in the brain. But the interesting thing is, of course, is that this is independent of the nature of the sound stimulus, and it is non-Boolean. So any symbol can represent anything. So it's very, very interesting aspect of this. It is governed by syntax. Okay. And that gives rise at the end of it to see issues to create language for things that cannot be seen or imagined at all. For example, the square root of -1, which is a purely, it can't even exist. That is its definition. A square root of -1 cannot exist. But all of you in your high school would remember complex arithmetical processes which involve the use of square root of -1. And we use it and we understand it without something like square root of -1 actually existing. It's purely a thought experiment. Okay. So all these abstract notions keep coming up. Can I have the next one? So to take a simple thing, the quick, the common typewriting thing, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy brown dog. There's a grammar to it. This sentence can be said by a mouth. It can be said by a hand, either through gesture language or by writing or by typing. Okay. So the organ of the grammar is the code. The brain that creates it. The transmitting mode can be anything from your mouth to your symbolic movements of your hand to typing on a keyboard. It is then transmitted through sound or writing, and then it is can be understood by either computer language or English or whatever sign language. And the organ of perception can be different depending whether it's the eye or the ear or the hand, which is in case of braille. But ultimately, the same grammar gets decoded. So it's the grammar which is guiding the transmission of information and not the sense organ itself. And therefore, the rules of the grammar become very important. Can I have the next one? So that comes to the modern theories of formal thought disorder. That you can have disorders at the pragmatic, semantic, syntactical, and phonemic level. The neurological disorders like aphasias typically have phonemic disorders. So they are unable to produce sounds. Whereas schizophrenia started the other end. The disorders are typically one of pragmatic and discourse and semantic levels, and very rarely those of phonemic levels, so that the actual mechanism of production of speech is intact. Whereas in neurology, that is the extent to which it can decay. Of course, it's not that simple always, but the phases are a whole thing in itself. But overall, this is basically what we can understand this as. Because in schizophrenia, phonemic abnormalities are not marked. At best, there are prosodic or subtle changes in expression and perception in schizophrenia. Syntactical abnormalities typically do not occur in schizophrenia. There can be odd sentence use or grammar use. Semantic abnormalities may be, like neologisms, more literal use than necessary. And pragmatic difficulties are difficulties in understanding conversation, the so-called ground glass appearance between the interviewer, between the clinician and the patient. So patients somehow don't seem to understand what is being talked about. Perhaps it is because they don't emit enough cues, the emotional nuances and affective tones are not there. But this basic theory is the basis for most of the MRI-based work on MRI correlates of formal thought disorder, delusional thinking, etc., etc. Because these principles are much more easy, are much more valid and reliable to measure in our current context than the other older definitions of Bloiler. Can I have the next one? So you can look at various approaches. You can look at lexical diversity. Uh, for example, uh, this whole idea that in patients with schizophrenia, when you compare their best reading score, for example, in the West, every child has to have the vocabulary tests at at various points in their life, and uh, and when asked later, the number they have often forgotten the words, the meaning of words that they knew earlier. So there is a kind of lexical diversity which is reduced. So to and the it's a common thing that we use in test. Name 10 animals. So that's a lexical diversity. How many different animals can you actually name? So that diversity becomes that's an empirical approach to look at how things are organized in the brain. There's a type token ratio. There's a verb adjective ratio. So how and how much detail or appropriate adjectives does anything defined. And typically, patients with schizophrenia will define it mainly in verbs. I did this, I went there, I did not spend a happy day, is will not be used so often. So adjective ratio comes down. TGG approaches, you can look at syntactical competence. Do they get distracted by embedded click sounds? And close analysis, which is a kind of thing that you omit a certain section of the paragraph of the patient's output, or ask them to read a paragraph in which every fifth word has been taken off, and can they understand what is being read, what is being communicated. You find that patients with schizophrenia find it very difficult to fill in the gaps. There can be content analysis, discourse analysis using attention and communicative errors, and communication styles within the family and social. That is back to more family models of schizophrenia. So these kinds of tests can be used in terms of linguistic analysis to check for formal thought disorder. Can I have the next one? And then there are various kinds of examples which are there in every textbook. You can see this in FISH or the CTP or the OTP. So we need not spend much time on this. But if you spend enough time in psychiatry, like I fortunately have, you actually see all these things. Predicated thinking is the Waldemar principle. Uh, so the subject and predicate ratio relationship gets opposite. Symmetrical reasoning: A is the father of B, B is the father of A, so the notion of time gets destroyed. We once had a patient who very cheerfully said, when I asked his name, I'm 40 years old, I'm 35 years old, and his son was standing there. The son was 40 years old. So I said, who is he? He's my son. I said, but you say you're 30 and you say your son is 40. He says, yes, yes, but you see, I'm growing old backwards. Full stop. So this kind of, there can be peculiar terms of logic which are used to explain even a distortion of time. They can be mystical, magical, that we discussed last time. So whether magical influences, where delusions can get when formal thought disorder can start having these kinds of ritualistic aspects of repetition of using words over and over again. This also leads on to issues of concrete thinking of Goldstein and Cameron, which is the lack of connection between successive thoughts and interpenetration of themes, which is again something we've already spoken about. Can we have the next one? Uh, in the last 30, 40 years, there have also been other issues like Shako, which is basically set theory, that whenever you're thinking or doing anything, you keep a set of associated ideas in your mind. For example, if you're working in ICU or you're doing cardiology or psychiatry, you will keep a set of skills in your mind which may be called into use. And you can shift these things very rapidly if the need arises. Patients with schizophrenia find it very difficult to shift these sets, and therefore Shako felt that there was a particular set shifting problem in schizophrenia, in the process of schizophrenia, and so that a greater response was being paid to irrelevant stimuli. Then you have personal construct theory, which is unable to develop an internally consistent set of ideas, which is related to something called the personal construct theory, which was very popular in the 60s to the 80s, 1960 to 1980. And of course, you have the definitions of Kurt Schneider: constancy versus transitory, organization versus driveling, and continuity versus desultory. So all these different kinds of ideas come in. All this can now be broken down into neuropsychological aspect, which is stimulus-driven thinking, information processing-driven models such as serial versus iconic processing models. Even now, for example, in the latest issue of Science, there's a whole issue of how the brain actually guides perception at the point of perception itself. Like we were talking about last time, the old ideas of Goethe about difference between dikhna and dekhna. So the brain actually guides or tunes the perceptual organs to respond to certain kinds of stimuli all the time. So there is no strict demarcation between perceptual and cognitive processes. They are one. Can I have the next one? Can I have the next slide? So ultimately, is there a schizophrenic way of thinking? So at the end of it, we can say that there's general difference in discourse, speech, and thought that are difficult to understand. So there probably is a schizophrenic way of thinking. Is there a schizophrenic way of thinking? Probably not, as several aspects seem to be dysfunctional, and there can be different levels of organization, and the disruption of which at various levels in a continuum gives rise to different manifestations. This is very, very important to understand because we now will need to understand that does occurrence of formal thought disorder in the onset of schizophrenia predict poverty of thought at the end of schizophrenia? Will it be like a positive and a negative state in the nature of thinking itself? So very often you find that these levels of organization get disrupted, and very often, at least in imams, you find patients in the chronic wards who once had very elaborate schizophrenic symptoms, but now are absolutely almost mute and incommunicative. They don't have any aphasias, their speech centers are perfectly intact, but they are simply lacking any way of communicating. So this is probably a much more complex process that we need to think of. It is not a single way that we are thinking about it. Is there a schizophrenic way of thinking? Yes, because all of us can adopt that style, and probably that is a very important aspect that we need to understand. That there is an aspect of schizophrenia thinking which is actually uh, blends in with normal experience. And why is it important? Because the schizophrenic way of thinking may actually be very useful. It may be useful to have these unusual patterns of synthesis of perceptions and ideas and cognitions, some of which may be completely novel, like the theory of gravity or the theory of relativity or the structure of the benzene molecule, or have certain prophetic ideas. So these may be very important in a positive way, but on the other hand, they are also important to understand that in society at large, double binds and deviant communication can also predominate, which is why you keep reading this public discourse about a schizophrenic politicians, schizophrenia of our polity. Is India becoming schizophrenic? So that is what is being referred to, that there is a deviant communication going on. And of course, paranoia has now become a social trait. At the bottom of the slide in the notes, I've given a list at the summary of it as to what is probably the most influential contemporary understanding of thought disorder, which is a list of items by Nancy Anderson of the 18 items that she uses to define thought disorders: poverty of speech, poverty of content of speech, pressure of speech, distractible speech, etc., etc. So these are the definitions which are part of the RDC, and then the mini, and then the scan, and those are the definitions that you will actually be required to know on the bedside. So I'm not going to bother about that because I presume by now you've been taught excellently by the faculty and your colleagues there. So but that is the real bedside definition that we use now, and those are available in almost every textbook at this point in time. Okay, can I have the next one? So then there are disorders of stream of ideas, um, and so flight of ideas, as you can see, there's a cartoon produced by one of our earlier residents, very interesting, which shows you on and off what flight of ideas means. Connections between uh, tangential or peripheral elements take priority. So the edge of one thought gives rise to another thought, the edge of that gives rise to another thought. And these superficial associations may include undue attention to the surface aspects of speech, otherwise known as clang. And then rhyming becomes more prominent, or qualitative adjectives, or word games, or punning. Speech thus becomes colorful, and people can even be singing or speaking in rhymes or use a lot of puns. One of my first experiences in psychiatry was as a medical student, where I had a patient who was manic and but who was a purohit, and he would sit cross-legged and keep reciting what we thought were shlokas till one of our more scholarly colleagues pointed out that he was actually making up and reciting dirty songs in Sanskrit. So because we all assume Sanskrit to be very rhythmic, so we thought he was reciting shlokas, but he was actually making up dirty songs. So it's that kind of thing which occurs. Again, uh, in the note section, I put in two poems by Spike Milligan, who is the founder president of the British Depressive and Manic Depressive Association. He was a very famous writer and actor and film producer, and he was born in India. And he wrote this. He wrote these many poems about about his illness, about manic depression. But it gives you an example of Hamlet. I presume all of you are familiar with "To be or not to be." Said Hamlet to Ophelia, "I'll draw a sketch of thee. What kind of pencil should I use? To be or not to be?" So this kind of very irreverent wordplay becomes common in flight of ideas. Can I have the next slide? So this is the other way around. That can be inhibition or retardation of thinking. The train of thought is slowed down, and the number of ideas that present is themselves decreased. This is again typical of depression and severe melancholic depression. So patients really feel that they cannot find the words to say anything. Patients have a difficulty in making decisions, lack of concentration, loss of clarity of thinking. There's an English writer by the name of Virginia Woolf, one of the most celebrated feminist novelists of the early 20th century, who had a first episode of depression at 13 and committed suicide by the time she was 55 after having written about, I think, 30 books and innumerable essays. But what upset her, what drew her to suicide, was that as a writer, she felt that the words were no longer coming to her mind. And if words don't come to her mind, she might as well be dead because she can no longer be a writer. So the specific symptom that she had was this inhibition or slowing of thinking, which was perceived as a completely horrible kind of experience when there is such a loss of clarity of thinking that it can drive you to suicide. So this is also a very painful symptom. Can I have the next slide? Then, of course, there are issues of which by now you are absolutely familiar with: circumstantiality, which is very unnecessary trivial details, like the example that Bloiler had. It's a failure of differentiation of the figure and the ground, so that there is that central theme of the stream of thought or consciousness is being distracted by all the peripheral stuff, and these can be this can give rise to circumstantial thinking. Perseveration, of course, when the mental act or the mental image or thought persists beyond the point at which they are relevant. And these can be verbal or ideational. They can be compulsive repetition, switching, or ideational perseveration. So the same ideas go around over and over again. For example, one of our patients uh, has a very uh, his perseverative thing is so detailed. It's an ideational perseveration. Somebody told him that he must keep a diary of what his day is like. So he keeps his daily diary at gaps of every 10 minutes. That I did this now, I have done this now, I have done this now. And he's been doing this for 10 or 15 years. So he's got a room full of of registers where he notes down every 10 minutes what he has done. He's not actually doing anything at all except writing this and sleeping most of the time or doing some other things. But he will write this down in a completely perseverative manner. Verbal stereotypies are the same word being repeated regardless of the situation, and many chronic schizophrenias develop this kind of behavior. Can I have the next slide? The others are, of course, self-explanatory. The various kinds of thought alienation processes, as we discussed, they can be made thoughts, made affects, made impulses, automatic obedience, negativism, and all these things can both be disorders of the boundaries of the self, an opposition of the will, or a absence of the will. So that not only can your affects be controlled by others, you can also have affects which are in opposition to others or in total subservience to others. So this is a very complex issue in which the core of your psychological being is being disrupted. Because, after all, like I mentioned earlier, this attribute of having autistic thinking allows you to separate your inner world from the outer world. And if that boundary between the inner and the outer are gone, and you don't really know who your inner self is, that becomes a kind of destruction of the psyche. And this gives rise to various odd things. For example, there's a person who I've been seeing for many years who believes that the group ABBA became rich mainly by reading his thoughts. That all the songs that ABBA made are actually his, and somehow they were able to read his thoughts and become rich. But actually, he's the one who should be getting all the royalties from ABBA songs. A medical student failed the Viva repeatedly because he could write quite well in the exams. But when he met other people, he assumed that they were able to read his mind. So he saw no point in a Viva exam. He said, the examiner knows what I know and knows what I'm going to say. So why say it? He expected to be passed every time purely because of thought reading. Thankfully, after about a year or two of clozapine, he was able to pass his exams. So it sounds very interesting, but it is actually quite dysfunctional. Poor chap couldn't complete his exams. He was a reasonably good doctor. There were no complaints about his work, but anytime there was an exam, he could not pass a viva because he assumed the examiners knew what he was thinking. Recently, because of this internet radios and internet, one young person came who felt that his life was being controlled by a uh, beat dubbed rave kind of music discotheque in Holland, which somehow controlled his entire movement. So this DJ, by the sequence of songs he played, controlled his entire life. So all these things can happen when the loss of self can occur through very elaborate processes. There's also something called thinking in unison, where you feel as if your thoughts are known to the crowd around you, that you have actually become inconsequential in a crowd, which is again a very painful feeling. And the loss and diffusion of the centrality of human experience or of your own self. Can I have the next slide? Then we'll quickly go on to delusions. We have, I think, another 5 or 6 slides. So, disorders of content, paranoia literally means a parallel but a different reality. So, para means parallel, as you know, nous means knowledge. So, being paranoid is having a parallel way of reality, which is not being governed, which is completely parallel. It can be governed by whatever rules there are of normal life, but it is parallel, it is not real life. And therefore, it's a very difficult situation that people find them in. Uh, this is the basic neurocognitive aspect of what is it that is real. Goes back to Indian philosophy of Maya and all that. But for every object that we have around us, there's a real meaning, there's an imaginary meaning, and a symbolic meaning. A chair is a chair is a chair. A chair can also be an imagined chair in a carpenter's mind when he has to make a new chair. You can go to a furniture and buy the chair that you imagined you would like, and a symbolic value, the chairman of the department, the chair of the proceedings. So at each point, an object has a real, imaginary, and a symbolic value. And going backwards, therefore, objects can have a symbolic nature, an imaginary nature, and a real nature. So delusions play around in this space between reality, imagination, and symbolic values and create their own cognitive space, which is parallel to what you are actually seeing or experiencing around you. Can we have the next one? This is something that, again, a favorite of MD exams and detailed notes and casework. And by now, you would all have know about this. What is a delusional mood and delusional perception? There's a vague sense of something going wrong, and the perception is the final coming together. Unlike the the loss of centrality of self, delusions are the other extreme. You feel yourself to be the center of the universe, that everything around you has a private meaning only and only for you. So, which is why severe formal thought disorder and delusions are supposed to be at two opposite ends of the cognitive spectrum. of the cognitive distortion of schizophrenia, which is why the MRI studies try to differentiate between delusional schizophrenias and so-called formal thought disorder schizophrenias. So here it's a completely different issue. And then you, of course, have the various issues of delusional misinterpretation and two-memberedness and how this whole perceptual alteration can also occur. So these can occur by almost any sensory cue, and that can also mean the memory of a sensory cue, as you are aware from the examples in Fish and any textbook of psychiatry. Can I have the next one? Of course, there are other secondary delusions which can arise out of a disorders of affect or from other uh, aspects of psychopathology, and then there can be Freudian explanation. The content of delusion, however, is very interesting because these are just case notes, because they can be extremely well systematized. Because, like I said, it's a parallel way of looking at reality. So your sense of reality is not lost. It is just that you've developed a uniquely personal way of looking at it. So they become very well systematized. And they can give rise, they can be so systemized that they can be a pseudo community. We actually had a patient who lived the Truman Show. Truman Show is a movie about 20 years ago, which says that parents, that there is some satellite in the sky which is following you, and everything that is happening around you is an elaborate set for the movie Truman Show. And we had a patient who obviously came in from the USA. He was living somewhere in California, but he came all the way to India to get away from the Truman Show because he was quite convinced that he is being tracked by satellites. And somehow his parents in India, because India is the space capital, somehow have the stack of VC of tapes and CDs which play out in his life. And he came back to his parents' house in Bangalore to look for those stack of CDs and tapes which he felt was guiding his life in America. Of course, he didn't find it. He only got antipsychotics, but that's a separate thing. Jealousy and all these things are self-explanatory, and so these can also be very, very elaborate based on very trivial kinds of sensory or other cues, and people can misinterpret innocuous cues and weave them into their delusional belief system. Of course, they're also seen in various other kinds of many kinds of disorders. Can I have the next slide? The other one is, of course, uh, of no, you've gone too far ahead. I want the one on delusion of love. Two slides before this, 34, I think. Yeah, 33. One before this, or one before this. Sorry, 33. Anyway, so anyway, there's a slide, yeah, of erotomania. These are also quite common. Fantasy lovers, Glenn syndrome, defined way back in the early 20th century, of grandiosity, and you'll get patients all the time with these kinds of things. We used to get lots of patients who claimed they were married to various politicians or politicians' daughters or politicians themselves. Right now, we have a patient who feels that she's married to the chief minister of a adjoining state. So you get all these kinds of very elaborate delusions of love, uh, which are quite common, and including of grandiosity. Can I have the next one? Then, of course, there are hypochondriacal delusions, and one of the patient we had removed all her teeth because of you know, conviction that the teeth were a phantom bite. And then you also have, and the son also developed a delusional disorder, and elaborate delusions of guilt, of nihilism. So all these are the context of delusions, which are interesting. They are rare syndromes, but basically they point out how people can have a completely parallel sense of reality. Okay, can I have the next one? The last is the very interesting aspects of Capgras syndrome, which encompass the whole range of how logic and perception and reality and emotion get intertwined to produce a very complex social delusion of Capgras. It is defined after Capgras, the delusions of it's a mirror image of prosopagnosia. So uh, in prosopagnosia you don't know the usefulness of objects or the object in front of you, but you can use it. Here is the other way around. You can see what the person is. You behave as if the person is the person who you think it is, but in your heart of hearts, you think they are an imposter. Okay, this is a classical thing which lies at the junction between can I have, which lies at the junction between neurology and psychiatry, and the historical or the mythological explanation is given there. But basically, the idea from neurology was that there's somehow a deficit in the right hemisphere, that there is some way of, and between the face recognition pathways in the dominant hemisphere, that the facial expression is being recognized, but the affective nuances of the face are being incorrectly understood by the right hemisphere. This mismatch between the right hemisphere attribution of affective tone to the left hemispheric face recognition gives rise to a mismatch. So the expressions and the affective memory of your relationship with your parent or your spouse no longer works. So although you recognize the face as being the same as that of your parent, they now lack the affective responses as if they were your parent. So there is some complex neurobiological aspect to this, which in neurology one must give them credit. They have been able to report many cases where disorders either of the left amygdala or of the right parietal cortex have actually produced these cases. So it's a fairly well defined syndrome. Of course, how much does that tell us about schizophrenia is not very well understood. But this is also goes back to the whole notion of intentionality. When I want to recognize, let's say, my spouse in a railway station, I need to look at the entire railway station and I need to recognize somebody positively as to who they are. Now, that whole process can be a very confusing process for the brain, especially when one has schizophrenia. So, what you recognize, what you don't recognize becomes an issue. So, for example, one of our patients insisted that the brother who's who's bringing her to hospital is not her real brother. Okay, Capgras. But the brother had been in the merchant navy and had been away from home for 3 years and had come back with a beard. So there was a little bit of sensory change. But none of us would really say just because somebody had grown a beard or shaved a beard that the person has changed. But she was quite convinced that this brother himself is a different person. So there's a mishmash between the actual change and the implied change in the nature of the brother. And the same lady also said that when she watches um, some movie with Madhuri Dixit, I think it was Kahuna Pyar Hai or something like that, uh, that the actress in the movie is not the real Madhuri Dixit anymore. It's a duplicate of the real Madhuri Dixit. So these kinds of very elaborate duplications can occur, and this tells you how consciousness itself is almost always a cognitive act, and there can be breaks in that cognition because of schizophrenia. Why that occurs is, of course, something that we need to understand. And I've given some of this explanation in the notes, so you can read more about this in the notes. Can I have the next one, which is hopefully the end? Can I have the next slide? Yeah. So Frigoli is the other end of the syndrome, which is a positive misidentification, named after the actor you could impersonate others, and this is when unfamiliar people are recognized as being familiar. So that is the opposite, and this also occurs with schizophrenia. So this, according to Leonard, was caused by excessive concretization of memory. So all minute details are retained, leading to subsequent misidentification. So that just because a person had the gesture, and you'll realize what I'm talking about when you go to a, let's say, a family wedding, And being a young person and you meet an uncle and aunt who's much older, they say, oh, actually, he talks just like his uncle of God knows how many years ago. That his mannerisms are just like that of his grand uncle, whom you have never seen. So because they have concretized their memory of their relative in a particular gesture, and because you are emitting that gesture, that whole personhood comes in. So this is something that we see all the time around us. Actors do it, mimics do it. Mimics can mimic the walk of Gandhi, the walk of Chaplin, and you don't need to do anything. For example, in the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, just the two specks are enough for you to imagine the whole of Gandhi. So this kind of concretization of memory does occur. Now, how is it occurring in the normal space and how is it occurring in the schizophrenia space or psychiatric space is something that we need to understand. Excellent account of all these delusions can be found here. I'm sorry, I think I've forgotten to add the slide with the references, but I shall add that at the next slide and then we'll go back. I think I've as usual, taken a bit longer than expected. So, any queries?
So it was a wonderful journey you took us through about the
Mhm.
disorders of thought, and I think this is one of the very gray areas where the initial training period we all struggle. One of which is the delusional perception, the
Mhm.
two-memberedness of uh, the thing. I mean, most of the students really struggle the initial first year to really understand what we are talking about. So, can you
Mhm.
just throw a bit of light on that?
See, it's basically going back to what we just mentioned about uh, a perception is a perception. Okay, so in the classical example, a spoon is a spoon, a crown on the spoon is a crown on the spoon. And very many children, I think first time the children are fed water in most parts of India, they're fed with a silver spoon or there's a spoon kept that this is the spoon that we gave your first sip of water from. Now, if that spoon also happens to have some emblem, and the person sees that spoon later in life, he says that no, this emblem means that when I was born, I was actually the reincarnation of a certain god. Now that becomes so that kind of two-memberedness. There's a true percept and there is a false percept, and the two are getting merged into a new novel idea. So by themselves, none both of them are not wrong. There is a two-memberedness to it. Each one of those facts is correct by itself. It's a combination of the facts which is delusional and which is a completely unique personal meaning to the person who's experiencing it. This is not something that can be shared with anybody. So this kind of a uniquely personalized interpretation of events is what is meant by delusional perception.
Absolutely, sir. I would request the students if you have any questions. Avinash, Advait, Sharon. Uh, Sir, I remember this patient you were talking about the brother who drew a bed. So I think in the
Hmm.
second admission, she also said
Hmm.
the brother's nose was a little thinner and
Yes,
crooked.
yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
yeah,
Yeah, but it was a very subtle change. I mean, all of us grow
right,
older,
right. Yeah.
so, but to assume that the person themselves have been exchanged is a fairly extreme position to take.
Hmm. Absolutely, absolutely, sir.
But
Um,
uh, but this person herself is an M.Tech. She's very
yeah.
highly qualified,
Mhm.
and so so perhaps that cognitive reserve that she has allows the brain also to make certain jumps of fantasy of reason in a bit interesting way.
Absolutely, sir. And I think she's the same girl who used to check your brain dominance, isn't it? Are you
I think
left-sided
so.
dominant? Yes, yes.
Something like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. She had her
Yes,
own.
yes. So, usually nowadays when we see patients with psychosis, especially the first episode ones. And most of them are youngsters who are more often on social media. So their way of communication is more through text, more through very mini use of abbreviations of languages, which are actually neologisms to the older generation, to the previous generation. So, sir, how do you think? I mean, how what process is going on here?
No, like I said, the the whole idea of language and thought is that it is genuinely infinite.
Mm-hmm.
It is genuinely infinite. So, for example, the idea of a cell phone could not have existed 30 years ago. So it's a gradual process. The capacity to have language itself, or the capacity to have thought, is infinite. These are just merely objects, whether you write by by your hand or by a computer or dictate terms to Alexa is just a tool. So the issue with schizophrenia is that you have to demonstrate, one has to look for the destruction of the nature of thinking, not the communication aspect. And
Mm-hmm.
like I said, it's very difficult sometimes because the two can get admixed. For example, talking of SMS or abbreviated language, there's a lady who we've been seeing again for many years, and she had this whole thing to reform the English language.
No.
So how we are using too many alphabets to say the same word, and if you actually shorten the word, it'll become English will become more efficient, and that technically is what SMS language is. So I have a whole
Absolutely.
page. I have a whole page of her writing where she has used certain
Oh,
words, and then so honesty is HNSTY. No need for the
okay.
OND. So she had a whole dictionary of what now would be called SMS words, but
Business.
she had thought of it 30 years ago. I was a medical student then. I was an MD student in '85. So she had made this entire list of how language should be written.
Right.
So it has
Absolutely,
its
sir.
advantages also.
No, it's quite interesting one. Um, so, sir, I think
See,
um, uh,
please feel free to ask questions because otherwise, I always get this feeling that you're being coerced to attend a class, which is not very pleasant. So please,
absolutely not, sir. Um, Avinash,
so please do,
Advait, yeah, Rosalie.
or you can send questions back on the email or
Yes, sir.
and post
Yes,
them
sir. What
back
would
on the
you
chat
want?
box, and I'll see what we can answer. We can answer some of those next time around. But
I think, sir, Dr. Advait has a question.
Uh, Ma'am, I'm still regarding the two-memberedness also. Only I still am not clear about it because in fish the example is given which sir quoted in his slide also regarding that the spoon had a crown and so is the two what is exactly two-memberedness in this terms, whether interpreting the crown and saying that therefore I'm related to the king, is that the two-memberedness, or planting it back in his memory, which the actual thing might have happened, like the spoon might actually have a crown, but giving it a different meaning, that is, I'm still confused.
the second aspect. So,
Okay.
like I said, the two-memberedness means that the events, each of these events, is technically accurate. It's the stitching them together of of attributing meaning to a particular event in a uniquely personal way is a delusional perception. Okay, so lies at the heart of that conversion from the mood state to the apophenic state to the actual delusional formation. Because earlier you know something is going wrong, and now everything becomes certain. So all these events, which are actually random around you, things go on around you without any meaning most of the time. I
Yes.
mean, I presume they have some meaning, but they don't have a personal meaning to you. But to be convinced that they have a personal meaning for you, for
Mm.
example, the typical example is the delusion of reference. People coughed on the street because they know I am a bad man. Okay, And that, why am I bad man? Because I did this or something else happened. So these, many of these phenomena, and why are they all doing this? Because of that particular point when the delusion arose, when the primary delusion arises, that this is the phenomenon that occurred. Again, one of the best thing is to read Schneider's account of this primary delusion is available on the net. Kurt Schneider's. It's also there in a book called Themes and Variations in European Psychiatry, which also available on the net these days. It's a classic. So these essays are made publicly available. Loyler's textbook is also made publicly available. So these accounts put these concepts clearly. Now, is it actually important in this current point in our management or understanding of schizophrenia? I have no idea. Okay, it is a historical. All this is a historical account of how schizophrenia are supposed to start, but very few people can give you an actual account of how schizophrenia starts. I
Yes, sir.
mean, number one, psychiatrists don't have the time to write 40-page case notes like Kaplan and Bloiler. Who would, if you see their notes, they are like pages and pages, 2 pages of patient speech transcribed. So, so we don't have the time or the patience to do that. So we really cannot. So these are historical accounts which we continue believing because of the historical nature. But in the real life, can you ever pick up the primary delusional percept unless you catch a patient in the very early phase of schizophrenia? Very difficult to say.
Yes, sir. Then I am clear. And the second doubt was like you cleared it as well, like regarding primary delusions. Like, do we,
Yes,
uh,
yes,
if it is a long-standing illness and the patient
yes.
is saying, so is it correct to call it a primary delusion, or it is safe to like maybe he'll not remember it exactly because since it is a long-standing illness. So that
Yeah,
was the
yeah.
other.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to very. I mean, in young people with schizophrenia, it is often interesting to understand all this. But after a while, all these phenomena lose their relevance. For example, one of the most, uh, so there was a lady who was in the ward, and she would spend a lot of time uh, almost mute. She would not talk to anybody, but she had a kind of superior attitude. And one day we got talking to her, and she told us that she was the empress of the world.
Mm.
And how did that come around? Because at night when she slept, the light, the light bulb, those are the filament bulbs, cast a particular shadow on the wall. And the shadow was that of a crown. And the crown was very large. And it somehow seemed to move from the wall and fit onto her head. And which is why she felt she was the empress of the world. And assuming, and she said, Doctor, you have to believe me when I tell you. So I said, yes. And once you believe that she's the empress of the world, then she tells you all the other things that she's capable of doing and how she's in touch with so many people and how she controls the world and how the world is driven by her ideas. But all that is subject to the fact that the light bulb transmitted the crown from the wall onto her head.
Mm.
So
Yes.
the best way to learn psychopathology is only by talking to patients. So there is no textbook which will be as elaborate,
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
especially patients who you otherwise think are very severely ill, because like I said, the whole process of how thinking gets distorted in mental illness is still not very clear. We can do whatever MRIs we want, but unless we understand what the patient was experiencing, the MRI will not be very useful. So we have to go into this new space of correlating the actual thinking of patients with the brain biology.
So I think Dr. Nabagata has posted a question in the chat box. So it goes
Okay,
like
I
this.
can see that.
Speaking
I'll
of
try and see.
lexical diversity before onset, is there
Hmm.
a subtle marker of FTD or language changes even years before the onset of
It's
schizophrenia?
it's not so subtle. It's not so subtle. Again, it's very difficult to decide on this because There are very few studies which have looked at lexical diversity early in the illness. Okay, it's typically in the West where they have these scores, that typically patients are seen in the 30s into all this neuropsych tests, and then go back to their school records and pull the lexical, their vocabulary skill or their whatever reading scores that they had when they were 14 or 15. So whether you would have detected that change by the time they were 20, I don't think, I am not aware of any study which has looked at that, but it could be a interesting way to look at it, to look at early decay of language skills as a marker of ultimate progression. But I'm not aware of any studies, so I can't tell you anything more about that.
And so we often see patients who have, combination of some kind of auditory hallucinations and ongoing delusions, which are often
Hmm.
very correlated.
Yes.
You remember we had a young girl who was a very excellent musician who
Hmm.
had hallucinations of Dawood Ibrahim,
Yes, yes,
which,
yes, yes, yes,
yes,
yes,
and the
yes.
same. I think in her peak of her psychosis, she suddenly fought with her father, saying that कि ये मुझे बोलते हैं कि ये तेरे बाप का घर है क्या?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. So the whole issue started, and she would confidently say initially these voices started coming from Dubai somewhere, almost like an extra
Mm-hmm.
confine, and then she believed that the parents are not treating her well, and
Yes,
there's a very concrete way of.
yes, yes, yes. So that is a very good example of real language. For example, I grew up in Delhi, uh, and in a vaguely Punjabi household, and all over in the house or in Delhi, it will not be uncommon to see parents, at least fathers, shout at this, "Oh, look at Patte." Now, does it really mean that he's abusing himself? Has he really turned into an owl? But we actually had a patient who believed that because he had been told Ullu Kapatha, that he was not actually the son of his father, because he had called me that word. Just like this young girl said when her father scolded her, not being too extravagant, "Tere baap ka ghar hai kya?" Now, that was the nucleus on which she built up a whole Capgras kind of delusion. That how can a father say this? "Tere baap ka ghar hai kya?" It means that he is not my real father. And this goes on and on. This built on itself to such an extent that they actually had to keep the father away. She would not be in the same room as the father for a long time. So this kind of idiosyncratic, concrete understanding is also quite troublesome. So this is an example both of concretization and condensation.
Yes, so. And so, in a similar context, although this patient is not psychotic, I would say a patient right now I'm seeing, she has severe
Mhm.
obsessionality, a lot of OCD symptoms. So, she has a very poor rapport with her father because the
Mhm.
father often blames everything on her OCD. And she believes that the
Mhm.
father is teasing her because of illness and a kind of
Mhm.
stigmatization happening in the house. So, one fine day, she started teasing her father back that, "Aap to kidney
Mhm.
patient ho, aap to kidney patient ho." So that kind of
Mhm.
association was a little odd to understand from her because she's an engineering graduate, and the context in which
Mhm.
stigma happens are very specific contexts. Somebody
Mhm.
having a diabetes or kidney disease,
Sure, sure.
it was a little difficult for me to understand.
So that's why, and see, that's why this Chomskyan generative grammar kind of ideas are very important. So this is a deficit in discourse. So the communicative aspect of speech is getting impaired. That she's now using the speech in a rude way, which is socially inappropriate. It is grammatically correct, it is factually correct. The father is probably having a kidney disease, but this whole notion that of using the speech to convey something that is not socially acceptable also becomes a kind of inappropriate language output, speech output, especially if it is occurring for no reason at all or occurring out of your own internal psychological cues. They're perfectly valid to tease anybody. And the right to offend or right to tease is a fundamental right in India, at least. But
Absolutely,
to
sir.
use it to use it beyond the point of relevance
Right.
becomes a stereotypy or a perseverative kind of behavior. So that
Mhm.
becomes a kind of schizophrenia kind of illness of a symptom, or you know, or just a tick or a repetitive utterance in severe
Mhm.
OCD.
Mhm.
But one still has to tease these concepts around, and after that, how do you differentiate between an actual compulsive act, a repetitive act, a perseverative act, a stereotypic act, or a language disorder becomes at one level a philosophical question,
Mhm.
but I mean, I don't think it has much to do with outcome, but it also helps you explain to the patient what these symptoms are and how to control them or tackle them after a while. So that understanding becomes very important for your engagement with the patient, other than
Right.
pharmacotherapy.
Right. Right. Um, Anyone has any other question?
I'm sorry about the reference list. It'll come in the next one.
Sure, sir. Sure. We'll do that.
Sure.
Um, I think, sir, they're still in the phase of talking to patients, which got little disrupted because of this COVID
Because of
time.
COVID, yes, yes,
Yes,
yes.
yes. So we
But
had a
but
couple of
thankfully, the social the social media is full of conspiracy theories. So you can
many,
just
sir.
apply
Many. Yeah, yeah.
you can just apply everything you read about delusions to the social media, and you won't be far off.
Absolutely, absolutely. Advait, do you want to ask anything?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Sure.
Ma'am, for reading, I was reading in this Fish talks about thought alienation in terms of ego syntonicity and ego dystonicity.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
I couldn't understand it very well. How to whether to label something which is ego syntonic or ego dystonic, whether it is the patient's own reporting that. Instead, like, this is not something I want still, how to differentiate between ego syntonicity and ego dystonicity.
See, see this. See, Fish's textbook is written in a particular philosophical viewpoint of 1940s to 60s, and so it must be understood in that context, which is now uh, not held in as high an esteem. It follows from Jasper's basic issue of understandability of psychotic phenomena. The idea is rather in Jasper's, that the psychotic phenomena are so far outside the realm of normal human experience that they are genuinely ununderstandable. No matter how much you try to understand what is happening, they are they cannot be explained by any process that we now know. So in that process, the concept of ego alien is the first one to come in, that these are completely outside my own mental space. So it is something that I do not want to do. I have not invented this act. Somebody is making me do this. It is nothing at all to do with me. I am writing. Somebody else has made me write. There's an exhibition on in London or America somewhere. Uh, Again, I'll try to send the link. This this a woman painter who's apparently very good, but who has been neglected for 100 years. She died sometime in 1930. But all her life, she never signed. She signed somebody else's name to the painting. She was a follower of Annie Besant, the Theosophical movement, and she felt that the spirits of the other world were guiding her hand, and therefore it would not be correct for her to write her own name, but to write the name of the spirit or the soul that had guided her hand to make that particular painting, which is why she remained unknown, because she never signed her own name. She only wrote the names of the spirits who were guiding her painting. Okay, so so that is a genuinely ego alien experience. Okay, now at the same time there's syntonicity and dystonicity, which means that is this whole experience somehow reaffirming my own sense of engagement. For example, do the voices I hear tell me I'm a great person, or do the voices tell me I'm a useless person and need to die? So these, so although they're ego alien because they're coming from outside my conscious space, they can equally be syntonic or dystonic. Impulses can also be syntonic or dystonic. Acts can also be syntonic or dystonic. So
Okay.
this between these definitions of ego alien, alienness, dystonicity, and syntonicity, and the inner and the outer space is a whole complex of arrows which can go up and down and can occur in any combination. Basically, that's the way uh, I understand it. But again, these are not again beyond their psychopathological, you know, fine dissection, whether they have any real meaning to the broad management of schizophrenia or management of any mental illness, or they are just transitory phenomena that occur in the course of an illness, we have no idea. See patients coming in and out of these symptoms all the time. So hallucinations which are ego alien then become inner voices, then become conversation, then become whispers, and then they disappear. So all these things are very fluid and dynamic. So it's very difficult to say whether these are fixed experiences in that sense.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now it's clear, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Thanks.
I think
All
so.
right then.
Yes, sir. We would like to hear you all the day. Um,
No,
uh,
that's I have to attend a
yes, sir.
conference now.
I understand. I understand,
4:30.
sir.
That's yeah.
So,
Okay.
so
All right.
if you can just send us the references,
The
the
reference
remaining
list.
things, that
I'll
would be
send them in the
wonderful.
next time. Next time we
Sure,
try
sir.
to do quickly perception and affect
Okay. Awesome,
together,
sir.
or in that should
All
finish the
right,
core
sir.
thing. Okay. Okay.
Thank you so
All
much,
right.
sir. Have a
Thank
nice
you.
day. Bye, sir.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.